Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'm Caroline Russell, Deputy Chair of the Assembly Environment Committee, standing in for Leonie Cooper, who will be joining us later. And I'd like to welcome everyone to our first meeting of the new Assembly year. First of all, members of the public are able to follow this meeting on webcast and also on Twitter using two hashtags, AssemblyEnv, that's ENV, and BurstMains. So get tweeting. And do we have any apologies for this meeting?
We've received apologies from Assembly Member Sean Bailey, and Assembly Member Keith Prince will be substituting for him.
Thank you. And could members please note the membership and chairing arrangements for the Environment Committee set out at item 2? Noted?
Yes, noted.
Thank you. And could members please note the terms of reference of the committee as stated on the agenda at item 3?
Noted.
Thank you. And will members note the standing delegation of authority at item 4?
Noted.
Thank you. And do we have any declarations of interest beyond those that we need to note in the list of offices on the report at item 5? No, and we've noted those that are in there. Thank you. And can we confirm the minutes of our meeting from the 16th of March 2017?
Yes.
Yes, agreed.
Thank you. And can we please note the list of completed and outstanding actions itemised under item 7?
Noted.
Thank you very much. And the action taken under delegated authority, can we please note the action taken by our chair, Leonie Cooper, under delegated authority at item 8?
Noted.
Noted.
Excellent, thank you. And that leads us on to our first of our main items on the agenda, water issues. And I would like to introduce our guests. We have, I'm going to do it in the order that you're sitting rather than the order that you're written out here. We have Richard Aylard, CVO, who's Director of External Affairs and Sustainability at Thames Water. Welcome. We have Paul Cuttle, OBE, who is the utilities expert and author of the report to Thames Water on the recent trunk main bursts. We have Nigel Dyer, who is the Chief Executive of Thames Water Infrastructure Alliance. And we have Helen Kakaratos, who is the Works Coordination and Permitting Manager at Transport for London. Welcome to all of you. And just move to my next piece of paper.
Permitting.
So to start off, I'll start with you, Paul. Can you please briefly describe the most significant findings and recommendations from your forensic report?
Thank you very much. Just to set the scene, I was approached around the middle of December to be the author of this report. I first met Thames on the 4th of January in their Reading offices, and the report was prepared by the 27th of March, and it got into the public domain around about the 25th of April. What I would wish to say for the committee's record is that throughout the 3 months that I was working on the report, the Chief Executive and all the staff at Thames Water were extremely helpful in the way they answered our questions. There was no occasion where I felt that information was being withheld, not at all. And I was struck by the consistent desire from amongst the staff within Thames Water with whom we engaged of their willingness to embrace the issues and to find ways that they could address the gaps, such that in future the performance of the asset and also how they respond in the event of failure was better than it was. So, and the final thing I would say is you will see that it's styled an independent report. and I can confirm that there were no occasions when I was under any fettering at all in terms of what I asked, who I asked, and what I wrote at the end of it. So I think it's important that that's in the committee's record from the outset. In the report, you'll see we've summarised findings under 4 categories, which is around asset planning, asset ops and maintenance, asset monitoring, and also event response and aftercare. And the overriding point that we make is that we concluded that there was no common cause of the 31 bursts that we assessed, including in particular the 8 bursts that we examined in considerable detail. These are the 8 in Q4 2016. That doesn't mean to say that this was in some way just, acts of God or bad luck or whatever. That's not what I'm saying. We spent a lot of time trying to understand whether there was any issue around the way these trunk mains had been ranked in the risk register, whether there was anything common around the age, the day of the week they burst, or the time of day. We did not find a common thread across the 31 and the 8 in particular when we looked at those particular issues, because at the outset there was an idea that it may be solely down to age of asset or the way Thames was managing the network on a daily basis, the way the flow of water changes through the 24-hour period, obviously as demand draws it down, and then in the lower demand as the reservoirs are then pumped back up to greater capacity. So we looked as to whether the bursts were occurring at the same time of the day. So when the flow changes from drawn back to then sent out again for demand, was that in some way particularly stressing the assets? These trunk main assets, I think it's worth just having in our mind that they're very similar to what I would recognise after 30 plus years in the electricity industry as the national grid. These are assets that move very, very high volumes of water from points of production, reservoirs, etc., to points of distribution, i.e. they're then moved out into the distribution mains, which are obviously much smaller than these trunk mains. So these are assets carrying millions of litres of water. They are assets that are typically low probability of failure assets, but very high consequence of failure assets. So whilst it might appear odd that there are 8 bursts in 1 quarter, and I'm calling them low probability, but historically these are low probability assets. But clearly when they do fail, they fail with very significant consequences in terms of water flow out from them. They're also typically very deep assets in terms of where they sit within the underground infrastructure, well underneath gas mains, electricity mains, telecoms, all sorts of things. They're typically at quite significant depths. So they are very major assets for Thames, but they're quite complicated assets. Although they're simplistic, they're big pipes shifting water from A to B, they are complex and difficult assets to maintain. Notwithstanding that, clearly Thames has the obligation, the requirement to manage them and operate them to the best of their capability and in accordance with absolute best practice. So that's why it was very much a data-driven piece of work. We captured a lot of information to draw these conclusions from, and we tested those items of data that we were given. You'll see in the report a record of the number of meetings we held, the number of workshops we held. This was not we took a piece of information from somebody and accepted it, we would actually go back round and seek to triangulate to make sure that what we were being told was, it's not about truth, Chair, it's about accuracy. It's making sure that that what we were gathering was actually something that we could draw conclusions from, because the CEO and the management team in Thames were very, very clear with me from the outset. This needed to be data driven rather than anecdote or opinion. That wouldn't necessarily be particularly helpful, and it was particularly helpful for me because, as you'll have seen, I've never worked in the water industry before. My background is electricity, and my background was EDF Energy and its predecessor companies. My last job was running the network in London and elsewhere. So the concept of managing high-profile assets was what Thames wanted. They were actually quite keen that it was non-water, so that I could come at it from a completely, I was going to say naive, but that's wrong as well, but from a completely fresh perspective. And so what we were given, we tested it through in as much detail as we could. We were very conscious of the need to arrive at this in a timely fashion. There was a huge amount of interest, and it was important that we got to the conclusions quickly. And you'll see that in the report, it speaks about under asset planning, it speaks about there is a clear risk methodology and effective asset manager risk model. But we then say there are inconsistencies in gaps in the trunk main asset data, notable errors in valve location and operability information. This has an immediate impact when Thames staff arrive in the event of a burst. They've got to be able to get to the valves quickly, so they've got to know where they are, they've got to know the condition they're in, and there certainly were some gaps we found there. We also, in the planning, we speak about there being a need for a single end-to-end owner for these assets. It was a particular point that I found. There were lots of people who in different parts of Thames who felt that they had ownership of these assets, but it was harder to find people who owned it from beginning to end. There were people who very clearly believed they owned it for the piece they were looking at, but from start to finish. So as the commodity leaves the reservoir to the issuing of a permit to work in actually managing these assets, it was not possible for us to find a single end-to-end owner. So that's why we recommended that Thames should do that, and Nigel and Richard will talk about the steps that Thames have taken already on that. The way these assets, we move into operations and maintenance, and I'm doing this in summary form, conscious that we'll need to get into questions on this. There was some evidence that from an operational perspective, when for instance, there is work going on around these assets, some of which was Thames Water driven themselves, there was insufficient handle on the need for the permit to work regime, for instance, to be as strong as it absolutely could be. One of the 8 high-profile incidents, and the guys have heard me say this before, was frankly an own goal. It was a contractor working for Thames Water hit the trunk mains. So, you know, there is clearly a gap there in terms of the permitting that allowed that contractor to be working in that area to strike to strike one of these significant trunk mains. There's clearly some work to do there. In these types of industries, and the same as with the one that I'm much more used to, critical individuals emerge over time, people with lots and lots of knowledge of particular geographies and particular assets, and we recommend that Thames do quite a lot of work there in ensuring that knowledge is moved into other people. there were some circumstances where key individuals had to be there for the response to be in the way it was. If they hadn't been there, the response would have been harder. It would have been trickier because the knowledge isn't there. And what I would say is that isn't unusual in these industries. They're very long-serving from an employment standpoint. I can't remember I think the average age in this activity in Thames is about early 40s, typically over 20 years service, so which is tremendous. But this knowledge that's within the organisation needs to be shared, and it's not about saying to one of these critical individuals, well, we need to take all this away from you. It's about making sure that if there's one person like that, there needs to be 6 of them, because then you build resilience into the organisation. Monitoring of these assets, they are underground. Some of them have been there for 150 years. It's you can't see them. It's not as if you can look at this asset, you just can't. And so one of the big planks that Thames Water have used in the past is around monitoring items such as HydroGuard and Cyrenix. These are monitoring systems which tell the operational staff or give the operational staff an indication of what is going on. They particularly react when pressures change, and that in one instance in particular, Cyrenix is the one system that is designed to help in the. It's very difficult to predict when one of these goes, but Cyrenix can indicate when pressures move and change. It starts to signal those things. But what we found was that data coming into Thames is not properly integrated into the rest of the control system. So when a control engineer is sat in the control room looking at the network and what it's doing, the Cyrenix information is actually coming into a secondary source. It's not all on the same screen. And it's important that the control engineer can see it all as things unfold. So we make a recommendation around that, integrating into what's known as the SCADA systems in terms of operational activity. We say that Thames doesn't have a large or particularly reliable understanding of the health of this network. It is very difficult to have a perspective at any one time as to what any 100-metre span in a 3,300 kilometres of network is doing. One of the bursts, actually, it was not corrosion in to out, it was corrosion out to in, which again is less than normal, but that's what happened. So again, you could have a device going down the main, looking at the inside, and it wouldn't have seen it because it's coming in from the outside. So, but I mean, this is a challenge that all water companies face. But it's something that we recommend that Thames continues to work on to see what else can be done involving their supply chain partners to identify and test yet more innovative solutions to arrive at asset condition information. And then the final area we looked at is, what can be done better in the event of a burst? Because frankly, there is no single silver bullet solution to this network of 3,300 kilometres. Even if Thames, leave aside investment, impact on bills or whatever, even if Thames said, well, I'll tell you what, we'll get this 3,000 kilometres off of the network and we'll replace it all, to imagine that could be done in anything less than decades, I would suggest, means that, I position this in one of the steering groups, an apprentice could join Thames Water today at 16 or 18, I think it's 18 now for you and me, they could work their whole career on this network. whilst Thames Water deals with the issues of replacement relining or redirecting in some other way. So the way Thames responds to a failure in this network will require ongoing attention. And you'll see we speak about inconsistency in response times, communication with customers falling short of expectation, the capacity of out-of-hours staff, you know, how many staff are on out of hours, where are they positioned, how quickly can they get to points, capturing and disseminating learning from events. Certainly in the business that I looked after, it's hugely important that, you know, things go wrong. But what's hugely important for managers and owners and operators of these assets is not to keep getting the same thing wrong. And that requires practicing and about really understanding what went on and taking the learnings out of that and changing the way that things are done to do all you can to avoid that happening again. So, I mean, in summary, Chair, that's how we went about it. That's what we found in terms of around planning, around O&M, around monitoring, and also what happens when a piece of network fails. The report is detailed. There's a lot of recommendations in there. Richard and Nigel will talk about how the company's responded to that. But you know, that's I think what I would wish to provide in terms of summary, and would be happy to answer any points of clarification the members have prior to the Richard and Nigel responding.
Thank you. I think, you know, all of us will be really worried by this idea of our water supply system being in a state where there is no common thread to the bursts, there's no common patterns, and where some of these bursts are very hard to detect, the one that corroded from the outside to inside. Now, you know, none of us have a ball that we can look into to define the future, but it seems that the challenge for Thames Water to maintain the security of our water system is absolutely immense, given that you don't know when, you know, it's hard to predict when these bursts might actually happen, and that they seem to be happening in different ways, in different contexts, at different places, at different times of day. You know, that is hugely challenging, and I think of immense worry to all Londoners, particularly those who have been affected by the bursts in the past and whose lives and businesses have been completely disrupted, and those who could be at risk in the future. Before we move on to the questions, I'm actually just going to give Nigel and Richard just a chance to just come back briefly, and then we will move into the questions.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to start by just saying how very sorry we are for the damage this has caused to people's lives, their property, their whole existence, really, all those who were flooded, and to those who lost water for short periods, but nevertheless that's very disruptive as well. So our priority has been to get people's lives and businesses back to normal as quickly as possible. I'm sure Nigel will talk more about that in a minute, but the most important thing I can say is that we accept all of the recommendations of Paul's report. We think it's very thorough, it's very helpful, and we've already started implementing those recommendations, and we're going to continue doing that, and I'll be happy to come back at some stage in the future and tell you how that progress is going, either in person or in writing, because the action plan is underway now. One of the biggest problems is to just identify the mains at greatest risk. As Paul said, it is very difficult to predict. And even if we were able to start a really big programme of replacement, as Paul says, it would take decades. So really, those two things both underline the importance of better monitoring, because we need to know, first of all, which pipes are at greatest risk so that we can do what we can to stop them bursting. And secondly, we need to know when we do get onto a major replacement programme, which has started now, but when we get to accelerate it, which bits are we going to do first? Because if it's going to take decades, it's very important we do it in the most efficient order and spend customers' money wisely to get the biggest benefit as quickly as possible. So better monitoring is really important. We've already picked up Paul's recommendation about having a single person to run our water networks. We have Tim McMahon is doing that job. So under the water managing director, we have one person doing strategy and planning, we have one person doing networks, we have one person producing the water, and we have Nigel's team doing the infrastructure work. So we do have one person who is now responsible, as Paul has recommended, for all aspects of the water network, and that is something we did a couple of years ago on the wastewater side, and it's been very successful. So we think that is an important first step. That team is now being established. We've also committed an additional £97 million to be spent over the next 3 years, over and above what was in our business plan, and that's on our trunk main network. And that means that we won't have to do temporary repairs on the pipes that have burst. They will be relined or replaced, and that will give some degree of reassurance, I hope, to local people that there isn't going to be a temporary repair that might cause yet another devastating incident. We've also, in terms of getting better information about the pipes, we've built, or we are building, an innovative pipe testing facility in Kempton Park, where we're going to be able to look at lengths of the pipe that have burst and lengths of the pipe that could burst, and test to find out what we can about them. Because one of the problems is that the pipes that we've got, as Paul explained, are deep underground, and they've got every sort of high voltage electricity, gas, telephone cables on top of them. So even if you wanted to, you can't get down there and take a look, certainly not at the outside of the pipes. So we have to get better at listening with the Serinic system and others, and we have to get more what we call Sahara chambers, so we can put devices down the inside of the pipe to try and find any flaws from the inside. But as Paul said, the flaws that have come from the outside are a particular challenge. Many of these pipes were laid over 100 years ago. They're very, very big, heavy pipes, and they were laid by hand. So some of them, the castings aren't absolutely perfect, and some of them, when they were put in, there was some damage which has lain undetected for a very long time. So we've got to get better at all of that. We're also...
Can I ask you to just
Speed
give a
up.
bit more of an overview?
Okay.
Yes, because we've got a lot of detailed questions to come in. So
2 quick points then. We've got a full review of all our 2,000 miles of trunk mains underway, which we'll report later this summer. And the second thing is we've made a number of improvements already to our customer communication channels. And I'll leave it there for the time being.
Okay, thank you. There will, I'm sure, be a lot of questions about the customer communication element of this, because that's how it actually affects Londoners. Nigel, do you want to just very briefly just respond initially before we move into the questions?
Of course, thank you, Chair. I think you've heard from Paul, there's a very comprehensive and detailed report into the primarily the 8 major bursts that we experienced in the latter half of last year. One of the cornerstones of that report is event management and customer aftercare. It's quite clear to me that the response to those events is variable at best, and we need to be very speedier in the way that we respond to those incidents. So we are investing quite heavily in our event management team should things go wrong, because invariably they will on the estate that we're trying to manage. So we're increasing our 24-hour team by 24 full-time individuals to make sure that they are liaising with our network control centre, but not just the technical aspects of closing down the network, but also working with affected people should a burst occur. I must stress that we are not a blue light service. However, we do have people on standby 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, and we are working collaboratively with emergency services to understand if we can be escorted to these events in the event of a major catastrophe. So there's a lot of work that we're trying to do just in terms of deploying our resources better, and also making sure that we are working with others to ensure we can get a more speedier response. I'd quickly just touch on monitoring, because to me that's a critically important aspect of ensuring the safety and the safeguard of our assets, to make sure that we don't disrupt the lives of people who may be affected. And again, we are investing further in monitoring techniques, and Richard and Paul have mentioned a few that are out there in the market that we can deploy. So there's a further £2 million investment between now and 2020 into monitoring techniques, and our team will be deploying those in the critical areas where there is potential high consequence, but as Paul says, historically low probability, but when these things happen, they clearly have a major impact. For enable us to ensure that we can replace these mains and repair them, we need great collaboration with highway authorities, and we spend a lot of time with TfL in particular. Our Chief Exec in Thames Water has met with Leon Daniels at TfL, just to ensure that we build the relationships to ensure we can enter the network at the appropriate time. And that's critically important because, again, as Paul has mentioned, to replace these assets is a period of time which will last decades and decades. I'd like to quickly touch on insurances because that's been the subject of quite substantive debate in the meetings that we've had with affected residents and also scrutiny panels from various local authorities. And Thames themselves have actually increased the indemnity rate for those people that are affected, where we will replace, like for like, the damaged materials and the damaged products that's been affected by these floods. We are actually working with those communities quite closely. I personally am attending the Islington team on a fortnightly basis to make sure we are executing and putting people's lives back to normal as quickly as we can. So apologies for a very brief overview, but
Thank you very
I think
much.
the detailed questions will be important ones.
Thank you. Well, I'm sure there will be a lot of questions. Assembly Member Arnold, would you like to?
Yes, Chair, thank you so much. I mean, if I ask both Richard and Nigel some specific questions, and then, because I think these questions lead in to Paul's report. But before I do, Chair, with your permission, can I ask that we acknowledge Councillor Richard Greening, who is with us in the public gallery today, and you know, commend the excellent work that he has done in convening the extra meetings in order for sharing and understanding of the work that's come out of the scrutiny panels of Islington, Hackney, Lambeth and Lewisham, and also for convening an informal meeting of sharing with us as Assembly members here at City Hall. So I'd just like to say to both Richard and Nigel that what we are putting to you is, if you like, included in what we're saying are the concerns that you will be picking up in recommendations from certainly these four boroughs, and I'm sure from other areas where we had so many burst pipes, especially in the Q4 of last year. Now, can I just go about response? Now, Richard, it's not the first time we've heard, and it's regrettable that it seems to me it's not going to be the last time that we'll hear an apology from Thames Water. So that's really why when we meet the public and when people are responding to us, they are so angry because they really expect, if you like, more from Thames Water. And I just wanted to start with that. And in terms of consistency, I mean, really, did it take all of these burst pipes for you to appreciate that you needed to increase the capacity in your response teams? Surely you will have seen this in terms of your risk assessment, in terms of the increasing numbers of bursts, added to that the increasing numbers of Londoners whose lives your service, because of it not working properly, is affected.
You said that Londoners expect more, and they're right to expect more, and we're trying to deliver more. Every burst is really serious to the people who are affected, and it's really serious for us. And we've been learning the lessons over time. One of the things that we had been working on was improving our social media capacity, which we knew was poor, frankly. We've accelerated that now. We have a 24/7 social media team which works very closely with colleagues in the customer and operational centres so that we can get information to as many people as possible, as quickly as possible. And that also frees up space on the telephone lines for people who need to contact us by phone. And we've got more agents to do that. The other thing we've done, and it's something that we've learnt from our work from the wastewater team on flooding, is that having people who can just manage the customer aspects of an incident at the scene is really important. So people, knowledgeable members of Thames Water staff, wearing the appropriate high-vis equipment who can just walk around and talk to people so that people don't have to, local people don't have to talk to the people who are also trying to operate the valves, coordinate with the emergency services and get things back online. So you've now got not just the operational team, you've got a customer incident management team who work 24/7 and who can be at the site of an incident like this generally within an hour and sometimes less. And once they're there, they will stay there over time and they will keep going back to see people, helping them with the insurance process and making sure that we get things back on track as quickly as possible. The other thing we're doing is we've got a new approach to insurance, which Nigel touched on. I know he'll want to add to what I've just said in a minute, but we're producing a booklet which anybody who has been flooded will now get a user-friendly, simple guide to the insurance process, what they need to do, what we will want, helpful phone numbers, contact points, etc. And we think that and the customer incident management team, we had some incidents in near Reading recently, and we had very good feedback, both on our social media and on the insurance process. It wasn't at the scale of the London bursts, but we should have done this sooner, but we are getting there now.
So you talked about social media, and that will be fine for those people with their phones. And this new booklet, that's going in every home because, of course, a great proportion of people don't live their lives via social media.
The booklet will go to anybody who's been flooded. As soon as we're aware they've been flooded, one of our customer incident reps will take the booklet, knock on the door. If somebody there, they'll talk them through it. If not, they'll put it through the door so that people have information about how to handle the insurance process as quickly as possible.
Okay, so it might be Nigel and Nigel do come in, because one of the things we heard from our colleagues from boroughs is, you will know that boroughs have emergency planning responsibilities and have EPOs, emergency planning officers. Now, I know Islington, and Councillor Greening will bear me out with this, their EPO has been trying unsuccessfully to obtain their risk register, the risk assessment for mains in their boroughs, given they've had so many burst pipes, and they believe that would help with the liaison. They believe that they would be better prepared. For instance, Thames Water, as I understand it, doesn't provide sandbags. The borough had to, on a number of occasions, provide that. The boroughs have had to get into clearing up the roads because Thames Water was not able to do that. So what of your relationship with boroughs and sharing information like the risk assessments so that the EPOs, you can put some sort of confidential seal around this, but at least that information would be available in boroughs. Nigel, let me come to you, because you're operational.
Okay, thank you. And yeah, I recognise that to make sure that the impact of these events, should they occur in the future, is minimised, we all need to work very closely together. We do fully understand the civil contingent liabilities that local authorities have, and we have committed to work more closely with them to make sure that our response and their response is done in a proper coordinated fashion. We do have materials deployed across our estate for these kind of events, such as sandbags and signs and various other things. So it is regrettable if in that particular incident that those sandbags weren't available, but I can take that away to have a look at that. But we do have a large stockpile of those materials, as I say, scattered across the Thames Water footprint. The risk register is a critical important piece of work for us, because that gives us an insight into where we believe those emergent risks are coming from. And if we have committed to share that risk register, I don't see any reason why that can't happen, because if we submit it and work collectively with the local authority, in this particular case Islington, we can understand, should we have a future event, there will be a proper contingent plan in place to allow us to respond quicker and faster. So I'm sorry I can't respond on the specific, but in general terms, we will take that away and certainly look at why that's not been provided.
So you see the sense of EPOs having access to this so that in their planning and their understanding of potential risk to areas, their town centres, that they should be able to factor this in? Is that what you're saying? You see the sense of that?
Absolutely. I think it's incumbent on all of us to utilise the information at our fingertips to make sure we've got an adequate and appropriate response in these events which are so devastating.
Yeah. And do you do that sort of sharing with TfL? Because, again, when you look at Q4, I can find a commonality, is that so many of them were along TfL roads, certainly in North London. Can I ask TfL if you have the same information or the direct access to the information that Thames Water has, given it's your roads that are then, if you like, blown up, and you then have to deal with the anger of the public?
Yes, thank you. No, I haven't seen the risk register myself. It's possible that somebody in TfL has seen it, but to my knowledge, we don't have that. And we would welcome greater visibility of Thames Water's plans for mains renewal, and also where they feel there is a risk. That stated, Thames Water do try to work with us where they do need to go in for emergency works. And we are working very closely with them at the moment in Islington on the upper streets replacement works. We have allowed them in ahead of the statutory timescales because we realise the impact and the importance of the main, and we welcome planned works because it's far easier to mitigate planned works in a timely fashion. We can inform residents, we can inform the travelling public that there is likely to be some delay to their journey. With an emergency, this of course is much more difficult, and we're reacting. So we welcome plans that Thames Water have to accelerate their replacement programme and to work with them. Clearly some locations are more difficult than others, but we're always happy to work with them to ensure minimum disruption for everybody.
Assembly Member Arnold, I think we were dealing with the question of TfL working is coming up later.
Yes, no, I'm coming back to the early warning systems.
Marvellous.
Yeah. No, and thanks for that, because it just fitted in nicely with that. We've heard about the early warning system. You talked about, I think it was you, Richard, who said, or it may have been Nigel, Thames Water is not a blue light service. But to the public, a burst mains pipe is an emergency. So they don't really differentiate and say Thames Water is not an emergency responder. What could you do to improve the situation that you're in? I mean, invariably, I understand it, the fire service arrive whenever there is a burst pipe emergency. Could you improve links with them? Are they alerted at the same time? It just seems to me it's a little bit passive to say we're not a blue light service, but you have to deal with one of the most, in some cases, common emergency that Londoners have had to deal with.
Yes, and you are right, the first responder tends to be the fire brigade. We are working very closely with the emergency services just to understand that exact point, how best we can respond quicker and more effectively. And we're having those conversations at length at the moment. I'd also like to highlight that our network control centre, we're looking to gain access to the CCTV camera network that is across London, and we do share information with TfL regarding CCTV footage. We are looking to understand whether there's technology out there that can advise us more speedier about bursts and the response to those bursts via CCTV footage, but also by trending messages on social media, because that's where these things tend to start. So as I said, we're not a blue light service. That is in no way a statement to demean the response. It's just, it is what it is. We do have people on standby 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And we are reviewing how best we deploy those people. Our coverage across the Thames estate is quite large, but we do have a substantive workforce. And we need to make sure that we understand where they're deployed, where they're based at home, and have we got the right coverage, and are there any hot spots that we're not covering, and how best do we make sure we've got resources in the right place. So please be assured we are doing quite a lot of work in that regard, because I think when these things do happen, if we can save 30 minutes, an hour, 90 minutes, 2 hours, it makes such a huge impact. So the immediacy of our response, by collaborating with emergency services, by understanding technology, by having an insightful understanding through CCTV footage of what the network's doing on the surface area, and allowing our network control team to have access to that can only help in that regard.
And so are you saying now there's going to be more direct contact with the fire service coming out of the Cuttle report and coming out of your experiences, or is that something that you've yet to discuss and organise?
I'd say those talks are starting. So what does that mean practically and at operating level? Because invariably when these things are reported, sometimes the scale of the report is not known immediately.
Right.
People just report a burst, as happened in Upper Street. But of course, quickly we can get access to CCTVs. We understood the scale of that burst as time unfolded relatively rapidly. So yes, we've got quite a bit of work to do there. Talks have been initiated. And as Richard commented earlier, we'll be happy to report back in due course about what progress we're making.
Okay. And lastly, you talked about compensation. It's good to hear that the like-for-like scheme will be implemented. But can I ask how you recognise those businesses who are closed due to the flooding? I'm thinking, and I'm not being parochially, it's just where the evidence is. In Hackney on State Newington Church Street, the businesses were not themselves flooded, but the street was flooded and closed off. So many days there was no business, but your scheme does not cover those businesses. Why is that?
So maybe Richard can come on to this shortly, but the immediate scheme that we have in place is insured losses. So it's making sure that people do get their property and their products and their belongings back to normality as quickly as possible. We're then going to compensate for loss for loss of earnings or a downturn in trade. Maybe Richard, don't you want to pick that
All I
point
would
up?
say is that if a business has lost custom because we've had a road blocked and customers haven't been able to get there, then we'll always consider that for compensation. All we would ask is just some form of simple documentary evidence to show what the loss was, so if they can show us the figures for the previous 2 quarters versus the quarter when we had the burst, we can compensate them for the difference. We do just ask to see some evidence of the loss.
But Richard, you may say that, but that isn't what's been reported to representatives across a number of boroughs.
Well, we'd be happy
There are businesses who themselves weren't, but they lost trade, and that had an impact. The burst pipe had an impact. And I'm sure you will pick this up in the submissions that will be made, and it's something that you will have to look at, because it's not clear in your documentation at the moment.
Well, I'm happy to pick that up, but if people can show that they have lost income as a direct result of a burst on one of our pipes, then we'll consider a compensation claim.
So it'll be in the new booklet?
It could be. I mean, that was intended for homes that have actually flooded, but we can give some better guidance for businesses on how they would claim. But all I would say is we do need to see some form of written evidence. It doesn't have to be very detailed, but it has to be something just to show what the loss was and over what period, and that it was directly a consequence of our actions. And if it does,
I
then we
would
can pick that
stress
up.
this because, again, I think you will find that wherever some of these incidences, it was business and homes. So it's just not good enough to produce one for homes.
Well,
you need one for businesses as well.
Okay, I take that point. The immediate aim is to help the people who have had their homes flooded to know how best to make a claim and what their options are, because in the immediate aftermath of a flood, people say, what do I do now? Well,
Yes.
The first decision is, are you going to claim through your own insurance, or are you going to come to us? And there are pros and cons, so we need to spell those out.
I just think you need to add business. Can I just ask, and maybe it's something that you wouldn't agree with, but a number of members of the public have said that they really don't feel as comfortable as they could, that it is you who are in charge of the compensation scheme, and have queried whether that's something that Ofwat should be responsible for, so they would feel more assured that they were getting a proper assessment and proper compensation.
Well, it's our responsibility to compensate people whose lives, businesses, homes we have damaged. So we will always look at those claims, we'll assess them fairly. If people don't think we have assessed it fairly, then either they can go to a solicitor, they can go to the Consumer Council for Water. Those are the bodies that represent consumers. Ofwat has an overview of the industry, and that they would always, I'm sure, take an interest. But really, it's the company's responsibility, and it's a very clear responsibility. So we've got to get better at explaining that and dealing with the claims. And they do go through our insurers, because they're the professional people who can assess things with our loss adjusters. Although, as Nigel says, we are now doing a new for old edition at the company's expense for people whose homes have been damaged. But it's our responsibility, and we'll pick it up.
Well, thank you for confirming that, because that came up on another occasion. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Just before we move on to you, Joanne, I'll just wanted to pick up one thing, which was the issue of basement flats and the early warning process for people in basement flats, because we were incredibly lucky in the Islington floods that no one was sleeping in those basements, but they were subject to catastrophic flooding that could well have led to loss of life if there had been if anyone had been sleeping there on that occasion. And do you think that you could be improving the sort of immediate flood response with perhaps some kind of GIS tool for your operatives on the ground, so that they can put in the location of the burst and then automatically know where that water is likely to go and identify the streets that need to have their doors knocked on urgently?
Yes. So as part of our existing understanding of where the high consequence impact of bursts could be, we already do topographical mapping to understand should a burst occur, what would be the affected area. Very similar to the work that EA do for flooding and those kind of issues. And that is already part of the criteria that we use to determine where we invest in our assets. So basement property hotspots is already part of the criteria that's in there. As for apps and technology, of course, we need to make sure that, as we understand the risk profile back in the office, we need to make sure that the operatives who are attending also have the same level of information. So the whole concept of asset transfer and knowledge transfer to the people who are therefore responsible on the site to be aware of what the potential impact could be is a critically important part of the Cutter report, but also how we move going forward. And our response to events through those dedicated customer response managers and customer support teams would benefit immensely from having that kind of information. And again, that knowledge transfer is something that we do need to think through more properly, and ideally use technology in that regard to make it more efficient and more effective.
So is that something that you are actually taking forward, having that kind of information available to people on the ground?
Yeah, the general sense is, how do we translate the data and knowledge that we have when we understand the potential mapping and impact of burst, and how do we give that to the front line? So rather than that, the specific, I think there's other issues as well we can do in that area.
It just seems that given you've got this incredibly arbitrary thing of bursts happening all over the place, to use technology to actually help you to respond more quickly and effectively just seems...
Yeah, absolutely.
Just one very, very quick point. One of the recommendations that in the ops and maintenance section is about not only the planning information flowing into the operational activity, it's also operational knowledge, experience and day-to-day data and information flowing back into the risk modelling regime. There's a piece of work to be done there where the modellers are given up-to-date, day-to-day information of what the operatives are seeing on a you know, not necessarily day-to-day basis, but you know, making sure the risk model is reflecting what's actually out there. So the piece between the modelling, which is hugely important, and the actual day-to-day evidencing of what's going on, the connection of those two needs to be more effective than has been in the past. And we touch on that in terms of how that day-to-day operational intelligence, to put it another way, is captured and reflected back into the modelling, so the model can be rerun to better understand the risk around that stretch of main with the up-to-date information.
Yep, thank you. Assembly Member McCartney.
Yes, I think some of my questions have already been answered about some of the report, but perhaps I could start with Paul. Can I ask, you were obviously commissioned to do the report. Have you also been commissioned to do any follow-up or to keep on at Thames Water to make sure they follow your recommendations?
The simple answer to that is no. I haven't been commissioned to do that, but part of the report is to ensure that well, first of all, Richard has explained that Thames have accepted all the recommendations. I think if that hadn't have been the case, then there would have been a dialogue that said, well, what's wrong with that one then? But the fact they came straight out and said, yeah, we're going to take all that. But also, I was satisfied that I understood how it'll now be taken into the longer term piece of strategy review, because what we did not look at was speed of investment, speed of replacement. We didn't want to get into this review. It's in the longer term piece of work. That's where it sits. This data is being reflected in that review, and Thames and its partners, one of which is on the strategic review, Ofwat have a representative on the strategic review steering group, such that the decisions around what happens to this network in terms of replacement, relining, in some instances it could be that some of it can be rerouted and some aspects abandoned. That's potentially possible, but that piece is underway and will report later in the year. So it was accepted in full, which was good to hear. And secondly, I was aware from pretty much the outset that there was a longer term piece of work to do. So the fact that I'm not involved in the longer term piece of work should not be seen as any backsliding on the part of Thames Water. It's just that the two steps were very clear, because again, in the report, this forensic review was part of 5 steps. The others are customer response around relining, so the immediate 97 million, the forensic review, social media and comms that Richard has spoken about, the trunk main strategic review led by Simon Hughes, who's responsible for strategy and planning, and then investment strategy as well.
So can I ask, the 97 million, was that a figure that you suggested, or was that a figure that Thames Water suggested? No,
it was Thames Water. They had already said in the way Thames reacted, on the ground on the day to these events, that they would undertake what they called no regret expenditure. It's a slightly curious way of describing it, but it's all that means is they'll spend this money irrespective of whether Ofwat then recognise it in a subsequent review. That's what no regret means. It's not about, we have no regrets. It's a slightly odd phrase. But, so no, and the 97 million reflects what Nigel's business and also 820, the large-scale infrastructure alliance, estimated the cost of replacement or relining would be for these. So it was a number that came out through that. I didn't pluck it out the air.
Okay. Forgive me for being rather sceptical, but we've been here before over the years with Thames Water. And when we had the expected drought in 2006, I chaired a committee and we were looking at the leakage from the system at that point. At that point, we were extremely sceptical. And a lot of what you said about improving your network, we're hearing again a decade later. And at that point, when we looked at you in 2006, you'd failed to meet Ofwat's leakage targets for the last few years. Can I ask, are you currently meeting Ofwat's leakage targets, or are you still not meeting those?
Since 2006, we've replaced a lot of our oldest distribution mains, and Paul made the distinction between the trunk mains, which are like the motorways of the water network, and the distribution mains, which are the sort of the side streets, if you like. And that actually is where the leakage is worst. Trunk mains don't leak very much.
Okay.
What happens is when they burst, and it's catastrophic. Distribution mains are where most of the leakage is. Since 2006, we've got leakage down by about a third, and we've hit 10 consecutive leakage targets. Unfortunately, we've missed it this year, so we've got quite a lot of catching up to do. But we have got leakage down a long way from 2006. It's gone back up. Our targets get tougher every year. We've got to get it back down again.
And the 97 million, is that sufficient?
Well, 97 million is, if you like, a first instalment. It's just what we need to do right now. So 70 million on replacing and relining the trunk mains that have burst recently. Some more money on monitoring. And there's a £20 million contingency in there, which will be decided as we work through Paul's recommendations. So it will help to implement, it will help to pay for some of that work. But that's only just a first instalment. That's a right now commitment. The other thing, as Paul said, is we're doing a much bigger piece of work, looking across the whole 2,000 miles of trunk mains, working out what the strategy should be, how we should assess them, what would be a sensible speed at which to replace them, how would we go about identifying where to do first. So Paul was a forensic review. What can we learn immediately from the bursts that have happened? And the wider piece is a much more long-term piece of work, which is going to report later on this year. And we'll also make that available to people in exactly the same way as we've made Paul's report available. But the 97 million is an immediate, here and now, let's just get on with it, expenditure.
And you said that this programme is going to take up to 30 years. Is there any way you're going to be able to bring that forward? And are you setting internal targets that you could release?
I think I'd like Paul to talk about that, because
it's an interesting point. In my knowledge, the only similar exercise we've seen to this to date has been the replacement of metal gas mains, and that was a 30-year programme of work. Now, 3,300 kilometres of excavation, withdrawal and replacement is an extraordinary venture to embark upon. To imagine that imagine you could do that in 10 years, I suspect the level of disruption, particularly in central London, would be so great as to be almost unbearable is a fairly strong word, but it would be very, very major disruption to roadways. So the strategic review that's going on, that's underway with this investment piece in it, it will model time against disruption. There's also a third, bit like a Rubik's Cube, the third bit is if you're trying to do so much work on the network, you're actually exposing the network to even greater risk, because the demand's not going away when you're doing all this work, and so you're having to, as it were, park the demand on other pieces of the network that whilst you've got large stretches out, and that sort of 3D modelling, plus adding in costs and the implications of those costs for both the owners and customers, it is not a straightforward, let's get it done in 10 years and that'll be fine. That it's if every party said we'll get this done in 10 years, and if nothing moves in London for 10 years, then we'll live with that because that's more important. And But so it's the way that conundrum comes together, and Thames don't have the answer to that yet.
But are you working on having, I'm just wondering whether perhaps you have annual targets that we could judge you against, or that you could judge yourselves against?
Yes, I mean,
Yep.
there will be targets in our business plan, but I think the important thing is that we have the conversation with all the stakeholders. So TfL's views will be very important, the view of this committee. When we've got that strategic review done, we need to have a big conversation, and that will then be built into our business planning process from 2020, which is where there will be annual targets you can hold us to,
Okay,
in the
thank
same
you.
way that you hold us to leakage targets now.
Yeah. Can I ask, I think my final question is around, you talked about new innovative and technology. I don't know whether Paul or Nigel can say whether you looked at anywhere else in the world as to how these pressures are being managed, and whether there's anything we could learn and put in place.
Yeah, my understanding and knowledge of that is pretty superficial, just for the 3 months I was there. My understanding is that within the strategy and planning and assurance team, there is plenty of sharing, both with other UK water companies, and a lot of collaborative work with the other UK water companies, and also supply chain partners, and by that we mean the large contractors who are involved. But the UK water companies are big players on the European and international stage as well. So, but the specifics, I don't know. So,
Yes, I mean, Richard mentioned our pipe testing facility in Kempton. So that's not just about testing the integrity of the pipes that we have. It's about looking at different materials, different technologies that you use to join those materials together and those pipe works. But we are part of a wider utility that talks to the other water companies and indeed other utility companies across the UK and across Europe. And that trade body in itself looks at different solutions. So we're already trialling various things at an operating level to make sure we can get access to the network safer, quicker and smarter. But we should never stop in our strive to make sure that we can use emerging technologies and even fund the research and development of that through our facility at Kempton, to be the world leader, I guess, in those areas. So from my business in particular, we are constantly challenging ourselves. Is there new technology out there? And we are funding quite an extensive R&D program just to look at emerging technologies and whether we can deploy them to become business as usual.
Okay, thank you. I suppose, Chair, it's just, if there are targets to be set, whether they could be formally notified to the committee.
Indeed, yes, that would be useful. I was actually going to say that when we had the meeting with the boroughs, people were talking about, well, partly, are there any targets for when these Victorian mains will be fully replaced? And I'm about to bring Helena in to talk about the practicalities of working with TfL, because I think if you think about the unplanned disruption to Londoners from these random bursts that are happening, then actually that starts to have an impact on the equation about whether we go for this rather slow progression that seems to be the plan at the moment, or whether that needs to be speeded up. But the other target that the boroughs have been thinking about is for Thames Water to have a target to reduce the number of people who are affected by water main bursts, and publish those figures and targets and progress reports on those targets. Paul, can I just ask, do you think a target like that might be something feasible to put in place?
as an immediate response,
Well,
I mean,
as a step coming out of the experience, we've certainly, the burst I know about personally is the Islington one, which has caused unbelievable disruption to people living throughout Islington, people travelling through Islington, and then the people actually directly involved, whose lives have been, and their businesses have been turned completely upside down. That is an awful lot of people whose lives are interrupted and affected by the workings of Thames Water. So could there be some kind of target to reduce disruption to Londoners?
I think there's two things, if I can. In the conversations I had with the control staff running the network, when there is a burst of this order, they have to make very fast decisions about whether to seek to reduce the flow from the burst at the expense of taking customers who are not affected by the burst off supply. So in some of these you'll see in the information, notwithstanding the fact of the immediate impact around the customers, residents and business in the immediate vicinity, supplies to just about everybody else were maintained. In some of these instances, no customers went off or lost their water supply. May have had some pressure flows, but the water remained. Now, one of the things that I was struck by is that is a decision that the control staff have to make very, very real time, and they're good at it. But they could slow the flow quicker out of the burst, but at the expense of other customers away from the immediate impact going off supply. Mm-hmm. And so one of the pieces of work that will have to be done is that discussion that within the control activity which says, do we slow the flow from a trunk main burst at the expense of taking off supply elsewhere and in fact impacting more people, or do we maintain the supply to those not impacted by the burst, recognising that the burst won't be slowed as speedily? And that's a very hard decision to make, but that's what the control staff have to do on a daily basis as they're managing the network, as mine did in the control room managing the electricity infrastructure. So that's one thing. Your point, I think that the other part of your question is, can Thames sectionalise the network better such that impacts affect fewer? And that, I think, is quite difficult on these large national grid type mains, because if you sectionalise it more and you seek to shut less off on that main, it is not without risk further elsewhere in the network, because large volumes of water will then be diverted somewhere else. So it isn't that the network can necessarily be chopped up in that way so that fewer are affected. And Nigel's point around, frankly, topography. In the Upper Street incident, there was a burst. It was whatever distance the pipe fractured in. Water will then find its course, and in terms of could fewer people have been affected by that flow? Once it's out of the main, it will flow down the course it's going to flow down. What we've talked about is reducing that flow such that the speed or the volume is reduced quicker than certainly in that Upper Street incident. So I think the answer is probably yes and no. I know that's not a particularly helpful answer, but I think sectionalisation can help. It is not risk-free on the rest of the network, but also the control people will have to make these very, very real-time decisions about, we can slow it there, but I'm going to take 50,000 people off water. So
basically you have with these bursts happening, you have two really tough decisions. Either the people nearest to the burst are sacrificed by slowing the water being turned off more slowly, and they experience more catastrophic flooding, and the extent of that is dependent randomly on the topography of the land around the place where the burst actually happens.
Yeah.
Or you slow it down more quickly. Yeah. There's less catastrophic flooding, but many more people are impacted, and the system may have some other bad effects in it as well.
For the record, I didn't say sacrifice. I said at expense thereof. But I take the point. But you're absolutely
but
right.
that's what the people experiencing
Yeah.
it will feel. They feel
Correct.
that they're being sacrificed for the greater good of maintaining the water supply to other people.
And what I would say is it's the same in the electricity industry and it's the same in the gas industry. As when faults occur, decisions have to be made in very short order. Now, as it happens, in the electricity industry, it is a quicker process because of the ability to automate. You know, when power fails, it fails. There's okay, you know, everyone's in darkness or all that, everything goes off. But the ability of an electricity network to recover quicker through automation is much greater. For gas and particularly for these mains, it is much harder to do.
I think this actually brings us to the point where we need to bring Helena in from Transport for London, because we've heard, you did say that, Paul, you said, you know, that causing disruption to Transport for London is unacceptable. Can we ask Helena, sort of, you know, what's the Transport for London view of, you know, if Thames Water wanted to speed up with the replacement of these mains?
Yes, thank you. I mean, firstly, we welcome the report. It brings up a lot of issues we've discussed with your Chief Executive, and the findings are very similar to feedback that we indeed have given. One of the things we would say is please do engage with us about mains that you wish to replace. We see bursts at certain locations go very frequently. The A406 Pinkham Way, I believe that burst 9 times last year, and I believe you are looking at plans to replace that. When we do have bursts, our data analysis shows that, generally speaking, for unplanned events on our network, we will expect to see something in the order of 5 times the amount of disruption from that unplanned event than we would if the event had been planned. So our general response is definitely to welcome more planned works, more replacement works, etc. And there are other ways of mitigation other than excavation, a full excavation and replacement. Things can be relined. I believe on the example of Pinkham Way, we are working with you. We'd like a little bit more information to move that main from underneath the carriageway to a location where they're much more sensible. I cannot emphasise enough how much we would welcome working with you on where you plan to replace your mains, because we have a lot of information we feel can assist you with that. For instance, where new developments are occurring, such as Brent Cross, and I bring again the example of Pinkham Way, we would want that main sorted and dealt with before we start major activity there. Well, as we've mentioned the example of Upper Street, I think it's a very good example of the difference between unplanned works and planned. When the main went at the end of December 2016 on Upper Street, there was enormous disruption to the residents and also to road users. Buses in particular were very affected, and I know from the scrutiny committee that that was a very major concern, and rightly so. What we have been able to do, and I mentioned earlier that we have waived the statutory period that Thames Water ought to provide us with at least 3 months' notice of major works. We've had less notice than that for the replacement works at Upper Street, but we've cooperated with Thames Water, as I said earlier, because of the importance of that main. But because we've had time to plan that, we are putting in, together with Thames, a number of mitigation measures that is keeping traffic flowing. And we are working with them to put in place a shuttle service, a shuttle bus service, whilst the southbound closure is in place, which is due in approximately July, but I know you've got technical difficulties at the moment, which mean you can't confirm the dates. So our general response is that we would welcome any planned works over immediate works. You are right to say it is a balance. If you were to replace the main at Pinkham exactly where it is, I just hope that I'm not in post when that happens. It's extremely difficult. That stated, it's burst 9 times and it's caused a significant amount of disruption each time. So there is a balance, but please work with us. I can't emphasise that enough.
Thank you. Yes.
I was actually going to raise the issue of Pinkham Way because it's in my constituency and it has caused great disruption. And I know when the carriageway further along was widened, there was a programme to move utilities to the side of the road. And I know you can't do that in much of London because of it's built up, but it seems to be on the major trunk roads or road network, there is space at the side. And in fact, if you were to do that, you could actually, perhaps it would operate like a bypass, so then you'd only have to have limited roadworks in the roadway where you're reconnecting it to existing network. Or is that a too simplified suggestion?
That's a very good suggestion, actually. I think what we've heard is the importance of effective dialogue, but also the importance of when we do intervene or have to make repairs, what the significant disruption it causes. So the A406 in particular, if we can relocate that main to an area whereby it's more serviceable in the future, it makes sense for everybody. And that's the conversations that we will have with TfL.
Good.
We do meet with TfL on a very regular basis. I think we have sessions every 3 months. So we need to make sure that the agenda for those sessions picks up these clearly important points such that we can give advance warning of what our intentions are for planned work, but also how best we collaborate and work together to ensure that the challenges and the tensions that the TfL team face regarding keeping traffic moving is also balanced with the importance of the assets that we need to replace. But it just emphasises this need to work better together.
Working better together, that seems like a really good outcome from from all of this, with the fire brigade as well as with TfL and yes, all people who are involved in this, and it is clearly a very, very challenging situation for Londoners going forward. And I think we all hope that.
If I can, Chair, there are a couple of examples where very, very deep collaboration across statutory authorities and also all utilities, and that's Crossrail and the Olympics, which I was involved in both. Crossrail in particular, we as utilities we were with Crossrail, I think 2 years before the bill even went to Parliament, such that there was a clear understanding of what we all had to get out the way. And for UKPN, there's an awful lot of stuff had to be got out the way in Liverpool Street. So, as an example, because if a significant red route is going to be opened up to make trunk main replacement, it absolutely makes sense to ask UKPN if there's anything they want to change whilst it's open. Now, it is tricky because clearly you've got all sorts of different depths but you know, it's not beyond engineering to do this, because we did it in the Olympic Park area, and we've also we undertook it with Crossrail. I understand that they are specific one-off events, and there's a very clear sense of direction and purpose to deliver something, and in the Olympics it was very time specific as well. But you know, there is something there that can be built upon. I would suggest that, and if nothing else, you know, using the example of Thames UKPN and the gas network operator, you know, just sharing the picture of the coming 10 years, because you know these assets are planned that far out for sure, and longer than that. You know, there's all sorts of demand modelling goes on, but there is something that can be done there. But what it needs is someone to draw those pieces together and sort of almost sponsor that conversation. And I don't have an answer as to who that would be, but in those two examples, it definitely worked.
Okay, so are you saying some kind of joint commission or body that is pan-London to look at
Yes.
tackling the water mains and
yeah.
other utilities and the roads.
Yeah, I mean, I can say yes to it because I don't work for him anymore, so it's not me who's going to have to do it. But but you know, having sat in the chair electricity-wise and seeing the benefit that accrued out of Olympic Park and Crossrail, it is definitely something that I think should be given some thought as to how, and I don't know who it would be, but how that happens.
Yes.
And I'm sure with UKPN and the other utilities, including Thames, if someone came along and said, you know, how about sending someone senior and knowledgeable along on a regular basis to do this, you know, they're not going to say no, because it makes...
Is that agreement?
Yeah. Because it makes sense,
Yeah.
and it worked.
Okay, Helena, did you have a response
Yes,
to that
I
idea?
would like to come in there because this is something we have tried. We have and have had some success. You mentioned gas there. They're very interesting because we often have 5-year plans from gas. We lack the detail, I'm afraid, from other utilities, Thames included. So it's such a simple idea, and it's something we've tried several times. We do have success. We have had lots of success, for instance, at Marylebone Road, where we have what we call workathons, and we have all the utilities working there at once. But I think what you're talking about is this exact thing about, you could call it master planning, where you know that there's going to be a development, and it's not rocket science that your new gas and water and electricity all needs to be provided. That's one element of it. And the other element of it is existing infrastructure. Each utility has its own 5-year, 10-year programme. Let's bring those together and see where we can shape those along with the known developments.
And the North Circular Road.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. So it's a piece of work we often try. We've actually just, I chair a group where we've just put that on the agenda again. I hasten to add this is not a new thing, but any role that you feel that TfL can have in that, we would welcome that.
And can I just get absolute confirmation from Thames here? You think this is a good idea?
And we do
and
collaborate
would
with
contribute.
other bodies, and I think once we have completed this review of what we need to do about the 2,000 miles of trunk mains and what the best investment strategy is, there has to be a conversation which will then lead to a plan, which will then lead to much better working. So where we do know that we're going to be replacing distribution mains ahead of time, then we do work with TfL. But clearly, the review that's underway, I don't want to prejudge the conclusions, but it's going to say we've got to do a lot more and a lot more quickly.
Yep.
And it will set out exactly what that looks like.
I think Helena's asking, can you send a senior person to her regular meetings?
Yes, we do.
And you will do that?
Yeah, we do already, but we'll continue to do so.
Excellent. I think we were meant to be finishing at 1:30. It is almost 1:30. Does anyone else have anything they want to add? I think it's time to thank our guests.
Chair, can we leave it open that if once we look at what we've done here today, that we then send extra questions, because we're still, I'm certainly still working through Paul's report on this area.
There's one question I wanted to ask Mr. Dyer. During the discussion, you mentioned that you could provide access to CCTV. What is it that you're regularly monitoring which could be of use to anyone else?
So if we have a major burst and we have access to CCTV records of the network, we can see that happening immediately in our control room. So we don't want to use CCTV to, I guess, proactively monitor the network in the sense that we're scanning everything. It's just that if we've got access to critical areas via the established CCTV network across London, it gives us another tool in our armoury to be able to see it quicker.
This is a CCTV network owned and operated by Thames Water?
No, sorry, no.
Owned and operated by others.
That's what I thought. You were talking some sort of secret network, and I was wondering, wasn't
No,
earth
my
were you
apologies for the
looking at?
confusion. No, it's the established infrastructure that we may be able to tap into. Private and public.
Just back to Paul. Paul, can you just confirm now? You said it at the beginning, but I just want to be clear. Your recommendations have been accepted by Thames Water.
Yes.
And from your understanding then, quickly, where does it go in the Thames Water system so that we can actually track this? So is it with the chief exec of Thames Water? What sort of bodies will be picking up these recommendations?
I mean, Richard can answer with the detail, but it is clear to me that the chief executive has asked the managing director for this business, this activity, to implement the recommendations that Thames has accepted in full. And its process, Richard can explain in greater detail, but there is a management process, but there's also an audit process within Thames that will look at the delivery of the recommendations against the action plan.
We have an executive team in Thames, which is headed by the chief executive, and I'm on it, and the managing director of Water is on it, and others, and it's our responsibility to oversee this programme of work. So what has happened is that each action, each recommendation from Paul's report is turned into a series of actions. Each of those actions has an owner and a timescale and a reporting line. And as the executive team, we make sure it's on track, and if it isn't, we make sure that we understand why and apply more resources so it gets back on track.
Okay, and your managing director of Water,
Yes.
can you name that person?
Sarah McMath.
Sarah.
M-C-M-A-T-H. She's newly appointed managing director of our wholesale water business. And Nigel reports to Sarah, as does Tim McMahon, who's the new head of water networks.
Thank you. It's just getting those names out in public.
Thank you. And this, I think we now draw this part of the meeting to a close. If I can thank all our guests for their input, and I will hand over the chair now to Lynn.
Well, thank you very much, Caroline, and can I just say thank you very much to our guests, and apologies for not being here for this first part of today's meeting, but I shall be looking at the transcript with a great deal of interest, and as we had Richard here only earlier on this year, thank you very much for coming back, and also thank you to Paul for coming to talk us through your report, which we were all very grateful to receive. The second part of today's session on water is going to have a slightly different panel, so we're going to be joined by some other guests. So thank you very much for those guests who've been with us this morning so far. We're going to be joined by Charlie Wood from the Environment Agency and Daniel Bicknell. We're going to make Richard stay for the whole thing. Thank you, Richard.
Okay.
From Daniel Bicknell from the GLA Environment team. And we're going to be moving on from talking about burst water mains to talking about a number of other issues relating to water as well. And I'm just going to momentarily bang the gavel and have about 30 seconds so we can change the nameplates. So this is not a cue for everyone to jump up.
Oh, you've got your own.
I've got my own nameplate. That's right. So here's one I prepared earlier. Not quite. Oh, it is now.
There you go.
So any time soon, I'm looking forward to the...
GLA Chamber Sound. GLA Chamber Sound. GLA Chamber Sound. GLA Chamber Sound.
today, and Richard, thank you very much for agreeing to stay for the whole of this session, both the first section and this. We'd like to talk a little bit about, we're going to start off with something around discharges from treatment works, and in particular, and I'm happy to take an answer from anyone, but I suspect Richard might want to start with an answer on this. What were the effects of the 2012 to 14 sewage discharges into the Thames, and particularly what were the impacts, if any, on London?
No discernible impacts on London. These were incidents that happened at 6 of our...
I forgot to rebang the gavel to say that we'd restarted, although having actually looked at some of the webcasts, I don't think they turn it off.
These were impacts that happened at 6 of our works in the Thames Valley, so well upstream from London, and they caused very significant local impacts, and that's why we were fined so heavily. And I can talk about those instances if you'd like me to, but the impact on London, as far as I'm concerned, and I think the Environment Agency would agree with this, was negligible, because by the time the flows have got to London, there's a massive amount of dilution that's taken place. That's not in any way to excuse the discharges, but you did specifically ask about London,
Yes.
and I don't believe there was an impact.
Perhaps you could then focus in on how those discharges actually happened. I mean, I think we've got a very helpful map
You can
showing
see where
your
they took
major
place,
sewage
yeah.
treatment works, including the ones that I think were involved in this particular incident. But obviously there are similar works in London, so it might be helpful for us to know how those discharges happened. And could it happen in London?
They happened between late 2012 and early 2014, and they all involved the same local management team. And without wanting to oversimplify a very complicated situation, the two common elements were lack of maintenance and investment, and the lack of management control. Now, those smaller works out in the Thames Valley don't have somebody on site 24/7. There's a team that works around between the sites, and there's very close monitoring via a series of alarms and instrumentation and data through to our control room in Reading. But these are small works, typically looking after populations of perhaps 50,000 people. The works in London, we have much bigger sewage works, so we have 5 basically. We have 5 big ones: Mogden, Beckton, Crossness, Riverside, Longreach, and 2 slightly smaller ones at Hogsmill and Beddington. But even the smaller ones there are dealing with a population of 250,000 people. And those works are of such a size that they have a team on site the whole time. So the process is being managed locally, and when an alarm goes off, it goes off in the local control room as well as in our control centre in Reading. So you've effectively got a sort of double safeguard there. So the local team will get on and sort out whatever the problem is immediately, but equally there's somebody watching them from Reading saying, have you dealt with this, what's going on, can we help, do you need extra resources? So the London works are less susceptible to the kind of problems that cause these issues in the Thames Valley.
So would it be fair to say that you feel more confident that the kind of incidents 2012 to 14 that happened would not happen in London?
For 3 reasons really. One is because, as I say, you've got people on site locally, but secondly because we have changed our operational management to divide the area up into small, so you've got tighter operational management, and there's been a lot of investment. Now, the one common theme that I think we probably could look at is one that I know, Chair, you've seen, which is the issue of what we call RAG. These are the wet wipes and other items that get into the sewers that shouldn't, and that's a problem across our network, and it was a contributory factor because we weren't controlling it properly at those smaller works. And the education campaign for our customers across the whole area is really important, and we've been doing a lot more leafleting, poster campaigns, local media campaigns to educate customers about what they can and can't put down the network. Our last campaign targeted 50,000 homes in some of the worst blockage areas, and that reduced blockages in the sewer network by 25%. And we're just kicking off another one next week, going to 100,000 homes, because quite clearly this is an effective way of not getting the wrong things into the sewers. People just don't know that they shouldn't be disposing of wet wipes unless we tell them. So we're now telling them over and over again, and the message does seem to be getting through, and that will help at the works, because once you've got RAG into a works, it's very difficult to get it out. The sewage works is one of the few pieces of infrastructure you can't stop. It's like trying to service a car with the engine running once something's gone wrong. You simply can't say, we'll switch it off for a few days or we'll divert it somewhere else. If it's a very small works, you can deal with it by tankering everything. But you can't turn off Beckton or Crossness.
We quite like you not to do that as well.
I thought you would.
And it might be quite helpful if the manufacturers of wet wipes didn't put flushable
Exactly.
on,
Well,
on the
that's another
packets.
conversation, yes.
But I'm going to ask my colleague David now to come in and talk about the impacts of possible discharges on London, if there was one.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I'll maybe ask the Environment Agency initially, Charlie, what do you think would be the impact if there were a discharge from one of London's major sewer works like Crossness or Beckton or Bogton, if it did happen?
Well, I mean, I'd probably go to Richard to talk about the specifics. But I think, we've been working closely with Thames Water and talking to them about the processes that Richard has said is improved, and we've seen improvements in the pollution incidents records. So, we feel confident that they're on track to making improvements, and we hope that that continues.
I mean, the impact would depend on how big the discharge was and how long it went on for. It would also actually depend on whether the tide was going in or out at the time. So there's a range of different factors. I'm not trying to minimise this. But on the one hand, any discharge from a London works could possibly be quite large because of the number of people that those works are serving. I mean, Beckton treats the waste from more than 2 million people. So discharge there could be a problem. On the other hand, the works is compartmentalised into a number of different streams, so it's very unlikely that all discharge at the same time. Plus, of course, you are discharging to a tidal river with quite a lot of dilution. But I think the main thing is just the safeguards that are in place and the fact that those works have been meeting their standards. And we have also, to cope with London's growth, all those 5 works have had major extensions. They've had highest treatment standards, more storm tank capacity, more treatment. So, there is more resilience in the system than there was 5 years ago.
How about the tributaries as well? I mean, you got Beddington and Hogsmill you mentioned.
Yeah, Beddington discharges into the River Wandle, which is an urban chalk stream, which is a very rare beast. It's very high quality water, and we have to watch. Beddington's are works that we watch with particular care. The Environment Agency have given us very tight discharge standards for Beddington because they match the standards to the quality of the receiving water. So if you're discharging into a chalk stream, you've got to achieve much higher standards. And Beddington's had a lot of work done, and it's meeting its standards. Okay. But that would a discharge at Beddington would undoubtedly have more environmental impact than a discharge at Beckton.
Have there ever been any problems at Beddington before?
There have been problems at Beddington, yes. I mean, there was a devastating pollution in 2007, which resulted in a significant fish kill, and in a lot of work being... That was a classic case of human error. But a lot of investment has gone on at Beddington, particularly around the screens and the storm tanks, to make sure that we don't damage the Wandle, which is a much-loved urban stream.
So it's how likely is it that there would be a discharge in future?
Well, it's as unlikely as we can make it. A lot of investment's gone in. We have tough standards. We have rigorous monitoring. We have managers who are looking at the output from their plants every hour. We have people, process controllers on site. If there were to be a problem, I think it's more likely to be through what we call third-party damage. So one of the problems with our sewers is that they are, in many ways, openly accessible. So if somebody decides that rather than taking a tanker full of liquid to be properly disposed of, they'll simply put it down a manhole, it can end up at the works, it can kill the bugs that we rely on, and it can go straight through into the river. So third-party damage is always a risk, and we every year we pick up quite a few. The other issue in the urban catchments is misconnections. We've got a lot of houses where foul waste from bathrooms and toilets, which ought to go into the sewers, is wrongly connected and goes into surface water. So we in the Environment Agency spend a lot of time trying to find those and sort them out.
What's the worst case scenario that you plan for, and how would you respond to your worst case scenario?
There's a number of worst case scenarios. I think probably third party damage would be my biggest worry, just because our network, and they used to be called public sewers. I mean, they are physically accessible in a lot of places. That would be my biggest worry. Other than that, it would be a process issue. We rely on natural processes to treat the sewage, friendly bugs, which we actually breed and maintain. If something comes in and kills the bugs, you can have a problem. The other problem would be human error, and we can only keep on top of somebody opening the wrong valve, misreading a dial. That's why we have alarms that are double banked to our system in Reading, so we've got process controllers at both ends looking to see what's going on.
There, obviously, you mentioned the Beddington incident in 2007 and the things that happened in the Upper Thames between 2012 and 2014. Has any disciplinary action been taken against the local management teams that were responsible for that?
In 2007, a couple of people left the business immediately afterwards. I don't want to say any more than that. As far as the issues I talked about earlier in 2012-2014, since those issues, the entire management chain has been changed right up to the managing director of wastewater. Now, some of those people are still in the business in other roles. Others have left the business. And I don't think it's right for me to get into discussing individuals, but certainly there was a lot of changes were made to ensure we don't go down that road again.
So if someone is responsible,
people are
take
responsible.
action
Action is taken. I mean, there was a proper, fair investigation as to what the cause was and whether this was a failure of supervision, whether it was a failure of training. There's a number of things that can cause these incidents, but we have a rigorous assessment of every incident, tracking right back to the root cause.
So are you happy that the people in place now have the highest level of competence?
We have a very high quality team in place in that area, as you would expect. But the other thing is that standards across the board are dramatically higher now, and that's being reflected in the lower rate of pollution incidents. We want to get down to 0 incidents. It'll be very difficult, very challenging across. We run 350 sewage treatment works, which operate 365 days a year. But the aim is to get to 0.
Yeah. Okay.
And the Environment Agency quite rightly keep our feet to the fire, and when it goes wrong, we get prosecuted.
Yeah. Would you like to say anything else? To add
Only just repeating what I said earlier, the improvements have been made, and we just hope that continues. And as Richard said, we meet all the way through the business at all different levels to keep these conversations going, to ensure that they do actually deliver what they say they will.
I'd give you an example. Our chief executive spent a whole day going around with the Environment Agency team doing unannounced visits to Thames Water sites, so that the EA team were able to say, look, here's the kind of thing we pick up on, and this is so he saw it all through their eyes, and that is reflected down at all levels in the business. We do work now very closely with the agency, and quite rightly, if things aren't going well, then they tell us.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Just before we move on to your next question, I'd particularly like to welcome Holly Park School from Barnet, and you've just come into the Environment Committee. Hello, and we'll just give you all a good wave. When we're actually having a discussion, this is the kind of thing when grown-ups sit around and we're talking about discharges from sewage treatment works, and Thames Water, obviously, here it is in a glass, but they also deal with what happens after you flush the toilet. So actually, essentially, Holly Park School, you've just walked in when we're having a big discussion about poo. If I can use the word, we're talking about what happens to everything that goes down the toilet after we flush it, and how does Thames Water deal with that? And if it goes wrong and it gets into our rivers, what could be the impacts of that? So we're talking about poo, I'm afraid, when you walked in. But it doesn't sound as though we're talking about poo, because we haven't mentioned that word until just now. David, I'm going to come back to you.
I think I'm fine. I've finished my
finished
questions.
David doesn't want to join the conversation anymore. Yes, he's refusing to play. So we're going to move on to Keith, who's going to talk a bit about drainage.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Keith.
Welcome to our friend in the gallery. If I could ask a question, could you briefly outline the challenge of combined sewage overflows in London and how it is being tackled?
I could start by saying I went to school in Barnet.
Yeah.
Nice to see everybody there. Yes, The combined system in London means that we take surface water off roads and roofs through the same pipes as the sewage from houses. So the challenge there is coping with the extra volume that comes after we've had very heavy and sustained rainfall, because the volume goes up very dramatically, and after a lot of rain you can have 9/10 surface water and 1/10 sewage going through the same pipes. And sometimes the system isn't big enough, and when that happens there are overflows which have been built over hundreds of years in order to make sure that they don't overflow into basements, people's homes, the underground. They go somewhere else, and generally where they go is into rivers and streams, because there isn't anywhere very much else for them to go. But they are designed in such a way that they shouldn't operate until the flow in the river has got considerably increased, because after rainfall you'll have more water in the river and then you'll have more dilution. But what we're doing is we're working with the Environment Agency to work out which of those overflows are the most damaging. Now, some of them will only operate once every 5 years. Others operate much more regularly. And the ones that the biggest ones of all are the ones from the big interceptor sewers into the River Thames. And that's where the Thames Tideway Tunnel will collect up those discharges, so that those overflows will no longer go into the river. They go down into the tunnel, and then it gets pumped out and treated at Beckton. But there are other smaller overflows on a lot of rivers and streams across London, and they can cause damage. I mean, if it's a really severe incident, you can get a fish kill. More often what you get is what's called sewage fungus, which is a nasty grey, slimy build-up on the water, which is very unattractive and undesirable. So what we're doing now is we're fitting a lot more monitoring on those CEOs. We're fitting CSOs, what we're fitting called event duration monitors, so we can work out just how often they discharge and how long for, and then we can work with the Environment Agency to work out what needs to be done. Can we route that flow for treatment? Can we find some other way? And one of there aren't all that many solutions available, but one of the ones that you can do is managing the catchment as a whole and trying to make sure that where possible surface water doesn't get into the foul sewers. That requires quite a lot of work, and even where we've got a separate network for surface water and foul water, sometimes there are cross connections that have been put in place, sometimes in the 50s and 60s when local authorities were running the whole network. If they had a local flooding problem, well, let's just divert it into the sewer. Now, we'd like to get those connections reversed. But if you're not careful, you just go back to causing the flooding problem that's caused the thing in the first place. So it requires a lot of work with local authorities, a lot of work with the Environment Agency, but it is ongoing at the moment.
There is an issue in my constituency with some of the 30s built houses,
yes,
where the rear drainage from the roof goes into the sewers rather than... Can you tell me what you're doing about that?
Well, yes. I mean, where we can, we would like to be having a separate network for surface water, which is what has happened in developments that have been built since the 30s. The problem is that you've got an awful lot of pipes, awful lot of small pipes, often under people's back gardens, and the cost of rerouting it is considerable. So what you have to do is look across the whole catchment and say, well, could we take a bit of water out of the network somewhere else, which means that those particular connections won't flood anymore. You've got to look at this at a big scale as well as the small scale, to try and work out what's the best thing to do, because it can be extremely expensive and disruptive. And it may be that sometimes when you look at the catchment scale, you can find a better, cheaper solution.
Okay. And as we know, Tideway will be going into Beckton. Clearly, the capacity in Beckton will have to increase enormously, I would imagine.
It's been increased. Yeah, Beckton was increased in size by a third, so that it can take the extra flow. I mean, what happens is that once the tunnel's built, which will be in 2023, it becomes a very long, thin storage tank. So wherever the extra rain flows, whichever of the CSOs discharge, all the way from Acton down to Dartford, it goes into the tunnel. The whole tunnel is available, and then it can get pumped out at Beckton within 48 hours. That's the way the whole thing has been sized to operate.
And what happens if that isn't sufficient capacity?
Well, about 4 times a year on average, we think that the tunnel will be beaten. You couldn't build a tunnel that was big enough to cope with any conceivable combination of storms. But the important point is that the tunnel will capture what we call the first flush. So if you've had 2 or 3 dry weeks, you get quite a lot of nasty stuff building up in the sewers. And then you have a thunderstorm or a big depression comes across, and the whole lot gets sort of punched out in one go. That's the first flush. That's the most polluting bit. All that will be captured in the tunnel, so that by the time, if the tunnel is going to get beaten 2, 3, 4 times a year, what you're then putting in the river is mainly rainwater, and the sewers have had a really good clean out. And by that stage, the flow in the Thames will be much higher, and the river can cope with it. I mean, this is the modelling we've done with the Environment Agency that shows that this is the right size of tunnel. Some people have suggested building a smaller one, but a smaller one would get beaten more often.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Before we move on, can I just check, and this is not a question for you,
Good.
Richard, Daniel or Charlie, does everybody from Holly Park School know that Thames Water are doing a big project called the Thames Tideway Tunnel, and there's going to be a ginormous tunnel under the River Thames? Did you all know that? It's going to be massive. Could you just say the size of the tunnel? Is it 1 double-decker bus could drive along it, or is it 2 next to each other?
It could fit 3 double-decker buses side by side. 7.2 metres diameter. So if you stand in a tube train and think how big the tunnel is there, it's bigger than that, and it's 15 miles long, and it will fill up with these storm discharges after just one heavy rainstorm, which shows you what's going in the river at the moment.
And how long is it going to take until it's finished, Richard?
It'll take till 2023. So we're beginning to, what we do is we put in these really big boring machines. They're the same size as the tunnel, and they chew their way along. At the moment we're digging the shafts, so we lower the tunnel boring machine in pieces, and we build it underground. And when it's built, it's 100 metres long, and it's a little sort of mobile factory. The front end scrapes away all the clay, and that then gets passed back, and then it comes up in a hoist and gets taken away by barge. So it's a really big piece. It's going to cost £4 billion. But it will clean up the Thames.
Slightly more than even your pocket money, Richard,
Absolutely.
I think. So now you know something that nobody else at your school knows, so don't tell them, keep it a secret. Okay, so we're going to move on to... Well, actually, there was just one question I wanted to add to that, which we were just talking... Keith raised the issue about water flowing off houses. Is there any mileage in forcing everybody to have some sort of water butt with a cut through into one of the major downpipes? Because obviously a lot of the water that comes off the roof...
You'd encourage them, rather
or
than
encourage
force them,
compulsory water butts? No, that's falling on stony ground over here.
They can get very nice subsidised water butts from our website, and it will certainly be much better for their plants than tap water, because rainfall is nice, soft water. And it will make a small amount of difference to what happens after a storm. But it is a pretty small difference.
Yeah. Can I just say, my colleague Joanne has checked it out, and she said that you could do a better reduction.
Assembly members are clearly looking for a better deal on behalf of their constituents,
Okay.
Richard. So I'd like you to bear that in mind. Tony, we're going to bring you in.
Very interesting.
Now, Keith. Behave.
Earlier in the discussion, it was said that you have choices in relation to water when we were talking about ordinary flooding. Can I confirm, whilst we have somebody here from the DOE, that you will invariably, in the case of likely sewage overflow, you would invariably ensure that it goes into the river rather than it is allowed to inundate properties?
Yes, if we had a choice, I think we and the Environment Agency would always prioritise property. One of the things that means is you do sometimes have to pump from the sewer network into a river or stream in order to protect housing, which is something we're very reluctant to do, yes. But we do it from time to time, and we've now bought, but obviously what that means is you've then got dilute sewage going into a river or stream. So we've now bought 6 packaged plants which will sit on the back of a flatbed lorry, and they will give a degree of treatment. So if we do have to pump, we can pump it through one of these units. so that what goes into the environment is as good as we can get it in the circumstances. But it would be very much a local discussion about that. But yes, we would prioritise protecting property.
It's a simple question of principle. Property before the river.
Certainly internal flooding we would want to prevent. If it was somebody's garden, that might be a more difficult discussion. But we would always protect property.
All right. Well, can I come on to flooding? I seem to recall that a previous discussion you told us that you had been a victim yourself.
Yes.
Of this. Can I ask you about how you're seeking to prevent properties from becoming inundated by sewage, if indeed there is anything that you can do to prevent property from being inundated by sewage?
It's very much a case by case based on the location. So we know where we have had properties that have flooded in the past, and we know why they have flooded, and we do modelling to establish what we could then do. And we try and spend the available money to protect as many houses as possible. So in some cases we might have one property that floods, and it would cost £2 or £3 million to sort it out. In another situation, we might have 50 properties that could be protected for £500,000. So we prioritise on the basis of getting the most number of properties protected at least cost. And we have quite a complicated formula that looks at how many properties, internal flooding versus external flooding on a weighting basis, which is agreed with the Consumer Council for Water. And we then work that across our area.
So is that a rolling programme for which you have a budget?
It is a rolling programme, and we do have funds allocated, yes.
Do insurance companies assist you in this?
No.
Should they? I'm not talking about a selfish thing, but if you're going to be reducing a risk, oughtn't insurance companies be contributing to that?
I think it's an interesting discussion. We would always talk to people about the insurance risks and how and where they can. Because in some situations, if we can't get an area-based solution, we may be able to protect an individual property. We have a little thing called a flip, which I think you know about, which is a local sort of pumping station, which makes sure that it isolates the property from flooding from the sewers. We have other properties where we have alarms in place, such that we can identify what's going to happen before it happens and take precautionary action. The other thing we're doing is we're getting much better at predicting where storms are going to hit and what the impact will be on the network. So we now have 15-minute forecasts from the Met Office based on 2-kilometre squares, and we can track depressions coming across from the west, and we can say, well, it's going to hit this area at this particular time, and we can actually get people pre-positioned in the site with sandbags. We can pump down wet wells. Even on the big network in London, we can sometimes make sure that there's as much capacity available as possible before the storm hits. So we're trying to prevent flooding as much as clearing up afterwards.
Can I ask how this is in terms of Thames Water's priorities for spending, given I think it will be reasonable to say that flooding from sewage is worse than flooding from, I don't know, some other kind of overflow, certainly rainwater, excessive rain, flooding a river. Ought you not to be spending more on the prevention, sort of pro rata, of flooding by sewage rather than flooding from some other surface water? Thank you.
The surface water flooding isn't principally our responsibility.
Right.
It's flooding from sewers and flooding from clean water bursts, the two main issues that we get.
Thank you. Clean water burst was the one I was looking for, so that's less harmful than sewage.
Yeah, but they both very seriously damage people's lives, and we have to do what we can in both situations. I mean, the clean water flooding is about identifying the pipes that are most likely to burst and do something about it, as we talked earlier. The sewer flooding is about understanding our networks better and doing what we can to protect houses. So we do we're still, since the floods in 2012, we take part in more than 50 different flood forums across our area. We work closely with local authorities and with the Environment Agency to try and make sure we've got schemes in place. But we are gradually reducing the number of properties at risk. So every year there are new sewer flooding schemes completed and communities that breathe a sigh of relief and say, it's not us anymore.
Yeah.
But there are still places where we're working.
Yeah. But you've already told us that you know where there is a propensity for sewage flooding.
We
you
do.
Can't know, because that's the discussion we've just had,
Yeah.
you can't know for sure where a water main is going to burst.
Yeah.
So if you know that somewhere has a propensity for flooding, that's something that you could instantly target, isn't it?
It is, but then we have to look at the costs of targeting it, because ultimately our bills are paid by our customers, and we need to make sure that we're spending their money as efficiently as possible. So we do try and look at where we can make the biggest impact with the money. It's a rolling programme. We've done a lot in West London and the Countess Creek area. I know we've done some in your area as well. But there is always going to be more to do, I'm afraid.
Thank you, Chairman.
Do you have a view about the paving over of front gardens? Because I mentioned water butts, and should they be compulsory or particularly encouraged? What about the paving over of front gardens with impermeable material? And I think we're going to wave goodbye to. We've managed to make our discussion rather dry, I think, compared to perhaps one that you might have been indulging if you've been leading that one. Paving over front gardens. People talk about that as a major contributor to surface water runoff.
London's lost 19% of its permeable area in the last 40 years, and that is partly through urbanisation, just concreting and asphalting, but quite a bit of it is actually front gardens as well. The planning system, as I understand it, means that if you are going to pave your front garden with an impermeable material, you need planning approval, whereas if you're going to use a permeable material, you don't. I don't know how well that is actually enforced. I'm not sure it's all that high up the average planning officer's list of things to go and check on, but we certainly wish it didn't happen, and we're very keen to see people like the RHS have done quite a lot of work talking about people how they can beautify their front gardens and make them nicer to live with. We've also done quite a lot of work looking at what can be done with permeable surfaces. So in terms of sustainable drainage, the easiest places to do that are with new development, and particularly where there's plenty of space. So we've deliberately tried to see what could you do where it's most difficult, which is in dense urban areas. So we've got 3 pilot schemes, 2 in Hammersmith and Fulham and 1 in Kensington and Chelsea, where we've taken areas of road and we've actually put in permeable surface and various planters and various other ways to soak up water. And all that is metered, so we can monitor what happens, as is a comparable piece of road nearby that we haven't done anything to. So we're looking to see whether it is actually cost effective to fit these permeable materials. And we don't know the answer yet, but we're looking at that, because if we could make road surfaces permeable, there's a few drawbacks to this, because one of the reasons people put surfaces underneath the road is because it's nice and dry. So we need to look at all this, but we're working, again, taking examples from around the world. What can we do? We're promoting green roofs. Anything that can slow down the amount of water going into the sewers. We'll do everything from protecting the CSO discharges through to protecting the kind of flooding that Tony was concerned about.
So a question both for you and for Charlie, which is, I've got 2 questions. One is, how strongly do you think it would be possible for the Mayor to address this in the London plan in terms of the paving over of gardens with impervious materials, and doing something through the London plan to really encourage that? And my second question, which is, how useful do you think the introduction of large earth bunds might be to slowing down surface water runoff? Because I know that they're being implemented in a number of places, for example, Burgess Park in Southwark, and I know that the large development in Barking is incorporating some very large earth bunds there. How helpful are they? Is that something we should introduce anywhere else? And I'd like to draw you both in there.
Okay, I think the first point, London plan, yes, we'll be contributing to the consultation, and we'd be very keen to see anything that would reduce paving over of anything with impermeable surfaces. Large earth bunds, again, it's all about the location and just the topography. You've got to be a little bit careful to design it properly to make sure you don't that your bund just doesn't funnel the water somewhere where you don't want it. but an awful lot can be done, provided you've got pretty good surface water. If it's contaminated by sewage, you're not going to create something that local people are going to like very much. So that you have to take local people with you. When we work with these streets in Hammersmith and Kensington, initially the reaction from residents was, we don't want any of that, thank you very much. Now it's finished, they're absolutely up for it. But that was a 3-year process to bring them with us. And I think the same involves, if you want to make people's parks look different with earth buns, you've got to explain to them why this is a good thing. There's quite a big outreach issue there.
And I think within the London plan, the thing that the Mayor could say is around the integrated water management strategies that I know Thames Water is really supportive of, and looking to have those in the opportunity areas. Yeah. And that stretches from water efficiency to flooding, and then engaging the communities as well, so that it encapsulates all the issues. So I think that's something specific that the Mayor could push for.
I mean, if I could perhaps add, it's something, obviously the London plan's looking largely at new development, so it's not particularly useful for dealing with existing development, and the existing development is the majority of the problem. So I think it's probably fair to say that new development is actually doing quite a good job in terms of sustainable drainage, and the existing London plan is strong in that area, so there's a very strong sustainable drainage policy in the London plan that has quite a clear hierarchy for how you should implement sustainable drainage, with a clear order of preference, with a steer towards greener solutions, but recognising that in some cases in the dense urban areas, you can't always have a swale or a pond that's going to attenuate water for any period of time, so there are other solutions like tank storage and so on and so forth. And what I'd say about bunds is, I'm not familiar with those actual examples, but the idea of sustainable drainage is primarily to deal with flood risk, but it has lots of other additional benefits as well. So it can help improve water quality, and how they're designed can have wider benefits for biodiversity as well. And so I think they do, where there is space, they have an important part to play actually.
Thank you. The final set of questions that we want to put to you today around water are more to do with supply and demand. And they're going to come from me. And my first question, and I'm happy to take an answer from all of you, but I'll probably start with Richard, is how can London ensure it has enough water to meet its needs?
Okay, the first thing is to make sure that we use the water we've got as efficiently as possible. So managing demand is really 3 overlapping elements to it. The first, of course, is reducing leakage. We've got a lot more to do around that, but it is time-consuming and it's quite expensive and disruptive. The second thing is we've got to get a lot more meters and in the ground. I'll explain why in a minute. And the third thing is we've got to encourage our customers actually to use less water. But it's the metering that brings those 3 things together, because it first of all provides the incentive to make the water efficiency really work, because if you're going to have a meter, you'll know how much you're using and you can save money on it. And metered customers typically use 12% less water. We think we can save people about £100 on their bill by showing them how to use water, particularly hot water, more efficiently. But the other thing that good metering does is it enables you to identify where the worst areas of leakage are, because if the meters that we're fitting are smart meters, so you get 1-hour readings, so you can very quickly analyse readings from the network and pick up where the leaks are worst. But it isn't just a question of getting meters in sort of helter-skelter as fast as possible everywhere. You need to target them so that you have got areas where you're metering the water going in, where you can also meter the water going out. Bearing in mind you can't meter every property individually. Blocks of flats, for instance, you have to fit a bulk meter to show how much that block's using, because you can't fit individual meters. So I'm rushing through this a bit, but working out with a smarter metered network will help to get demand down. But that won't be enough to cope with 1.8 million extra people by 2040 and potential climate change, or climate change kicking in over that period. So we're going to have a new source of water, or sources of water, during that period. That's why we do these long-term water resource management plans, and ours is going out for consultation in January next year. So we're just working through what the various options might be and what's the best overall package for customers.
Charlie and Daniel, do you want to come in on that as well?
Just that we're working with Thames Water on those options to, ensure that they're the right options for the future, and making sure that we really do plan as far ahead as possible. So in looking at a potential new Thames barrier, we've used an adaptive pathways approach, and they're using a similar approach to planning for water resources, so we can really look that long term ahead and have the lead-in times we need for any of the new resources that they might be required.
Yes, similarly, we're looking to review the different options. Recognise that there's 4 key options on the table with the potential to be brought forward. So, interested to see what the best solution is for Londoners, really. But also the role of we haven't really discussed water reuse so much, and that's where it links to the sustainable drainage element, and I think the integrated water management strategies that Charlie mentioned. There's a potential role at the more ambitious end of the scale to actually look at reusing some of the water, some of the rainwater that falls on new developments through innovative approaches. So we think it's particularly applicable to areas where they're quite large new developments, like the Mayor's opportunity areas. But we'd be very interested in seeing some of that brought forward.
I can see that Keith wants to come in, but I just wanted to ask you, you've just said that the consultation is going to start in January. I just wondered if you could give us the timescale for the rollout of the new strategic water supply and going through that sort of option consultation, and then when will we actually have it? Okay. Let's say it's a new reservoir in Oxfordshire, for example.
The next water resource management plan kicks in April 2020. And the first 5 years of it will be reflected in our business plan, which covers the same period. Water resource management planning used to be done on the basis of guidance which said you must plan for 25 years, and if you think you've got a case for planning for more than 25 years, you can make it and we'll see what we think. That's been turned on its head by the Government Environment Agency. It now says you must plan over whatever period you think is appropriate for your customers in your area, as long as it's at least 25 years. And that is a huge difference. So our plan this time is going to be looking 50 to 80 years ahead for the needs of our customers. Because actually 25 years in water resource terms is nothing, particularly when we know what kind of growth we're expecting in London. So it's going to be a really long-term plan. And as Charlie says, it's going to be based on these adaptive pathways, so that we don't have to decide firmly now what we're going to do in 2060. But we can show the points at which along the way, if we've reached this particular point, then we go that way, and if we haven't, we go the other way. So it's exactly the same way as the Thames Barrier successor, but it means that we can look at things over a proper time scale. So big consultation 2018, implement 2020, but then keeping going.
Looking forward to that consultation. Keith, you wanted to come in.
Thank you. Yes. Clearly, being an island and even having the tidal river, we're not short of water around us, but I know that desalination is something like 10, 20 times as expensive as surface water. What about, though, the water that's treated, let's say, at Beckton? How much more expensive would it be to make that usable?
This is what we call wastewater reuse. And what you would do is you would take the effluent from a sewage works, which is otherwise going to go into the river, and you'd treat it to a higher than normal standard, and you would then probably put it into a reservoir where it would mix with all the other water you'd collected from the sky, and it would then be treated to drinking water standard. So it's a two-stage process. The question is what technology you use to treat the water from the sewage works. There are 2 options, one of which is basically a sort of biological membrane process. The other one is to use reverse osmosis, exactly the same as you would for desalination, except we haven't got salt to take out. We've been taking advice from around the world on experts on wastewater reuse, and they say that to do it safely, using water that's come from the Beckton catchment, for instance, you would need to use a membrane technology. So you would then be not at the same level of cost as desalination, but still quite high cost. The other consideration is that it's a pretty high-tech process, and you have to think about how much of our water treatment do we want to be doing through a very high-tech membrane process. So it's perfectly possible It's one of the options that's being looked at in the plan, but it's not quite as much of a no-brainer as you might think. We have to weigh it up against all the other options to produce a package.
But here in City Hall, we recycle water.
Yeah.
And I think if more households were encouraged to
You can certainly recycle it for non-potable use. And again, when we're looking at the opportunity area type developments, if we can get a dual network, potable and non-potable, because it isn't actually more drinking water we need, it's more water. The drinking water bit's fine. Now, if you're doing, 10, 15, 20,000 houses, you can put in a separate network. You've got to be really careful about the public health impacts, because if somebody uses the non-potable water and drinks a glass, they're not going to be in a very good state. So there's quite a big customer education piece, particularly in a country like this, where every time you turn any tap on, it's safe to drink. Well, in this case, some of these taps won't be.
So
but if you can use it for toilet flushing, you can use it for garden watering, you can use it for car washing, and that's all great. And if we can do that, that will help to keep the demand down. But whether that's not going to provide enough potential, we don't think, to give us the water, give us the extra water we need, because those are in sort of discrete areas. We think we can get 30, maybe 33 million litres a day from doing that, but we're actually looking to get several hundred. So we're going to need to do other things as well as that.
Sharon, you wanted to come in.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think the options you're looking at were the options that you told us about 10 years ago. So I think these major infrastructures do take time, and for a new reservoir, we obviously have to persuade the residents of Oxfordshire that it's a good thing too. But two other things that you talked about a while ago, and I presume one of them maybe just has been ruled out on cost, but was a national water grid. Is that definitely being ruled out? And secondly, Thames Water also told us that there's proposals for an artificial recharge scheme in South London to replenish an underground reservoir during the winter, to then be released during the summer.
I see you've got very good notes from the past.
I've looked at our report we did.
The national water grid is an idea that's been around for a long time, and what its proponents suggest is that somehow we don't move water around and we don't share it between companies. Well, actually we do. There's a lot of local interconnections between adjacent companies. So we send water every day to Essex and Suffolk Water, and we send water to Affinity Water, and we can also, if we need to, send it to Sutton and East Surrey and South East Water. So we're quite well connected. The idea that you would have a fixed grid covering the whole country, first of all, it's very expensive to build, and secondly, you only need it during a drought. Most of the time we've got enough water. What we're trying to do here is actually stave off the risk of a drought that would cause real problems for London. So you'd be building all this infrastructure, and once you've built water pipes, you can't just shut them off and expect to use them when you need them. You have to have what's called a sweetening flow to keep going through all the time. So your operating costs of pumping and moving the water around, because it doesn't just flow down from Scotland, it's got to go up and down. There's a lot of pumping involved. So I think local connections are more likely. But one of the options we're looking at is to bring water across from the River Severn into the Thames. And there's pros and cons about that. We need to find out, first of all, can we guarantee that the Severn will have enough water to spare when we actually need it, bearing in mind, again, we only need it when there's a drought on. If it's really dry for us, how dry will it be for them? Can we top it up from Lake Vyrnwy? There's all sorts of other things. The other issue, which Charlie may want to touch on, is that if you move water around over long distances, you can actually end up moving invasive species around as well. So you've got to be a little bit careful. You also end up mixing water of different qualities. So again, it's not quite as simple as it sounds, but one of the options we're looking at very seriously is a transfer from, I think it's fair to say all the options have pros and cons. And we're just having to work them through in great detail, the economic, environmental and social costs of all of them, to try and work out what's the best overall package for customers. And that's the process that will kick off next year.
And the underground reservoir in South
London?
London?
Oh, that's happening.
It is?
Yeah, that's the Horton Kirby aquifer recharge. And we do, when we've got enough water in the winter, we recharge that. And that helps because the southeast London is an area that's we can't supply from the Thames. It's outside our ring main, so it's groundwater, and that's a particularly sensitive area. So artificial recharge in southeast London is really helpful.
Thank you. I'd like to move on to just talking a little bit about you touched briefly on the need for behaviour change around water use, and also about the rollout of metering. And I wondered if you could give us a sense of how far the metering rollout in London has gone and what progress you're expecting to make on that over, let's say, the next 5 years. But then I also would like to ask, and I'd like to bring in Daniel and possibly Charlie on this as well, about behaviour change programmes. I mean, money has gone into these and helped people understand their water use much more clearly and helped them to reduce their water use quite dramatically. And I wondered, is that something that, for example, that the GLA might also be looking to put some money into, working in conjunction with Thames Water? Because I do think behaviour change to get people to reduce water is as important as getting the meters installed. So we can start with meters and then move on to behaviour change programmes.
We've got 146,000 smart meters installed so far, and that's giving us a huge amount of data because each of those meters is giving us a reading every hour. So that's telling us how much our customers are using.
I didn't realise you were being so intrusive about my water use, Richard, until you just told me that, because I'm one of your water meter customers.
But you can go online, if you have one of our smart meters, you can go online and see how much you've used this week, last week. But having those meters in the ground is actually giving a real incentive for people to think about their water use. And we've developed something called smarter home visits, and we've done 60,000 of those this year. And what happens is our delivery partner is Groundwork, many of you will know, is an environmental charity. And somebody from Groundwork comes, knocks on the door and says, I think I could help you save some water. And people expect them to say, I'll have to make a booking for an appointment in 2 or 3 weeks, and that's when these things all fall over. But actually what happens is he says, I've got all the gear in the van, I can do it in the next 20 minutes if you can spare the time. And then he comes in with an iPad and an app and talks to people about their water use and actually fits low-flow shower heads, mixer taps, spray nozzles for garden hoses, and actually talks to people about their water use there and then.
20
60,000 of those. Sorry?
In 20 minutes, he does all that?
Well, it starts in 20 minutes, but it goes on. 20 minutes is the conversation, and then you get the fitting afterwards. But I mean, the point about it is you don't have to book a slot. The person is there with the kit in the van and gets on with it. And 60,000 of those smarter home visits are saving us quite a lot of water. So we're now gearing up to do even more of that, because it is behaviour change, but it does fit well with the metering programme. But what we need to look at really is, rather than saying, well, how much on leakage, how much on metering, how much on water efficiency, it's how much water can we save, how efficiently, for how much money. So we're looking at all the information we've got from the metering programme and working out where we go from here. The other thing is we're getting, there's two things. The first thing is we're getting more benefit than we expected from bulk meters. So if we've got a block of flats, most of them we can't give people an individual meter for each flat, because you often have all the kitchens connected up one side and all the bathrooms connected up the other, so you haven't got a single point of entry to the flat to meter. So we put a bulk meter on the flat, and we can then compare it with flats of similar size. And we found some very dramatic what we call wastage inside the flat. Quite often it's to do with toilet seals that have perished. People don't know that their loo is actually discharging slowly the whole time. And if all the flats in a block are doing that 24/7, that's a lot of water. So these bulk meters are enabling us to identify quite a lot of more leakage than we expected. The other thing we can do when we fit a meter is we can work out whether there's a leak on the customer's pipes, because it will show up. And we thought we knew how much customer side leakage there was, and we were more or less right. But what we're finding is that rather than having a relatively small number of relatively large leaks, we've got a relatively large number of relatively small leaks. So we're having to do a lot more work. So again, it comes down to an efficiency thing. So we're trying to work out at the moment how we can get the best overall programme, with the water efficiency giving us more than we thought, bulk metering giving us more than we thought. How does all that fit together for the future? And that work's going on at the moment. So I can't give you an absolute number of how many meters will go in, but the programme is being rolled out.
I suspect when we come to look at the proposed plan,
the consultation document
That'll be part of it.
next
It'll
year.
all be in there.
Hopefully we'll be looking at that as well.
Yeah.
Daniel, I just wondered whether there was any thoughts about funding small programmes. So I think Renew, which included panels being fitted up the back of single-sided radiators, also included you know, insulation for letterboxes and things like that, but also allowed for fitting new shower heads and different taps and things like that. So it was a sort of combined energy and water, very small fittings, but can obviously make quite a difference, and a bit of advice to people. Is the GLA thinking of doing anything like that again?
Yeah, I think phase 1 and 2 have happened. Phase 3 is coming, I think, in short. I don't know anything about, I don't know the exact numbers at the moment, but there's certainly an appetite to... The main mechanism probably is Renew, actually, so that's the energy efficiency scheme, but linking in the water element as well. And of course, you know, if you increase water efficiency and reduce water use, there's a carbon implication associated with that as well. So making that linkage. We've had a positive conversation with Thames about doing something, but it's early days at the moment. But the idea would be, I think we'll be bidding for European funding, ERDF funding, for a project.
Fast is all I'm saying on that one. Can I just ask then, if you can't give us the figures now, perhaps you could come back to the committee with the detail of that when that's known, either about what's going on now or what you're going to be bidding for.
Sure.
My last question sort of flows on a bit from some of the points that Keith was just making about use of grey water and recycled water in domestic properties. And I just wondered if, and it's possibly one for Richard, but it might be one for the Environment Agency and Charlie as well, possibly even you, Daniel. Office buildings. I mean, obviously we use grey water here in the toilets at City Hall. How widespread is that in office blocks? Is that something that we're looking at trying to ensure happens in new buildings? Is it something that we're looking to retrofit into other buildings? Because certainly... where you were talking, Richard, about a block of flats and there's a sort of loos that are, you know, constantly flushing, but it's on a very small scale. I've been into office buildings and found exactly that. And are we working with building management, those big building management companies to get them to do some monitoring? Because I would have thought the savings could be quite large from that sort of thing.
The savings could be quite large. Unfortunately, because water's so cheap, it isn't an awfully big cost for the building manager. So you need a building manager who's prepared to do something or is persuaded to do something because it's the right thing to do rather than because it's going to save a huge chunk off the water bill. But we have fitted some really good kit in our own office in Reading, and we've saved 80% of water. So there's a lot to go at. And we do have a campaign working with building owners. But as I say, it is very much dependent on a bit of goodwill and a bit of interest from people at the other end, because actually the costs aren't all that great. There's a lot of water, but it's not a huge cost in terms of running a building where the energy is always the biggest cost.
Keith?
Sorry, yeah, waterless urinals. I've seen them in a few commercial properties, but it doesn't seem to be something that's adopted by local authorities.
Shame Holly Park School aren't still here for this part of the discussion.
Yeah, indeed. Is there any mileage in encouraging that? That seems to save hundreds of thousands of litres.
Yes, certainly working with local authorities. That what's changed recently, though, of course, is that the non-household water sector is now competitive. So it depends a bit on who your retailer is, whether they're going to offer that as an added value service or not. And we want to continue working with councils to save water. But if they're buying their water through a retailer, then there's a different relationship there that we have to work our way round.
But surely the reason I said councils is because they are not so much profit driven, and they should have more of a social conscience and understand the value of saving water.
Yeah. Well, certainly we did some, when we started our smart metering programme, we started it in Bexley, and we did some work with the council on their buildings, and we've saved them quite a lot of water. We've done the same in Reading and in Swindon. So if councils are interested, we're more than happy to go along. We've done lots of programmes in schools as well.
Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you very much for moving on from the burst water mains to sewage treatment discharges and then on into looking at water saving. and the other issues that we've covered today. I'd just like to ask members if they are happy to delegate authority to me as the chair, in conjunction with party group lead members, to agree any specific outputs arising from the discussions that we've just had. And are you minded to note the discussions that we've just completed? Thank you. Item 10 on the agenda is our work programme. And unfortunately, I think we had already previously noted that we might need a bit of flexibility due to an event that apparently took place on the 8th of June, which some of you may be familiar with. We were forced to observe political purdah, and so some reports have not become available. So the environment strategy, which you'll recall Patrick Feely said to us would be available by the end of May, unfortunately is now going to be ready somewhat later, or it's going to be released somewhat later. There's a series of reports to release. So are you happy for us to switch our July meeting, when we were minded to ask the Deputy Mayor for Environment to come and talk about the draft environment strategy? Our next meeting is going to be taking place on the 13th of July. It will be at 2:30 and it will be in this chamber. The final item is there any other business that is urgent? I don't consider there to be any urgent business, so I'd like to bring this meeting to a close. Thank you.
GLA, Chamber, Sound. 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 GLA, Chamber, Sound.